Allow me to pour you a drink from the forbidden teapot. Holley Sniper vs. Phytech update. So it looks like the Holley works as advertised. Wow. Who would have thought? I mean, I certainly didn't. I bought a Phytech. I drove the S10 over 20 miles with no problems whatsoever. So if you're on the fence between the two, I definitely recommend the Holley Sniper. And with that, we'll jump into the next episode. Back at the end of 2021, Mike and I successfully installed the Holley Sniper in the S10. And whether it sounded great or sounded like in order to complete the installation and to comply with local motor vehicle laws, I'd have to build an exhaust system for the truck. However, doing so poses a few challenges. This engine and transmission combination was never offered on this truck from the factory, and the vehicle that this transmission did come on had no frame rails, which meant there was a little bit more room for the exhaust to squeeze past the transmission. But in this truck, which is a body-on-frame construction, the only practical exhaust routing is also where the slave cylinder for the transmission clutch happens to be. So in this episode, not only will we be building an exhaust system, but we will be removing that clutch slave cylinder to replace it with an internal throwout bearing style slave cylinder, or donut I guess you'd call it at this point. Completely undoing the bastardized slave cylinder we painstakingly came up with in a previous episode. Since this new slave cylinder will be housed on the input shaft of the transmission inside the bell housing, we will have to remove the drive shaft and then remove the transmission. We can also completely delete and set aside the slave cylinder and hydraulic line that was made previously, as it will not be reinstalled. The new slave cylinder completely eliminates the need for a clutch fork, so we can remove this as well. As with all hard-to-find oddball parts, this slave cylinder uses AN fittings, which no store carries on their shelves, so I had to order a few different kits in different sizes until I found one that works with my setup. And of course, the GM master cylinder uses metric threads, so I had to get an adapter for that to make it accept AN fittings. I get that these are supposed to be a little bit more versatile than like hard brake line, but seriously, why don't any stores carry this stuff if it's such a good option? I would much rather use 1/4 inch brake line with this cylinder if I could. One can dream though, and this is what we have to work with, so let's try and make ourselves a clutch line. The included instructions with this Evil Energy kit were pretty straightforward, and after a couple tries I managed to crimp a couple ends onto a line of the appropriate length. Clutch line clearance has been an issue since day one of this swap, and these AN fittings and adapters don't make it any easier. This should be avoided at all costs. This is absolutely close enough to boil the fluid in the lines, and will need to be addressed with either an insulator or a different master cylinder design. To ensure a full range of motion on the clutch, the kit comes with some shims that go up against the slave cylinder. To determine how many shims should be used, we will take a measurement from the top of the clutch fingers to the face of the transmission mating surface on the bell housing. We can then measure from the mating surface of the transmission to the frontmost surface of the slave cylinder. We can then add or remove shims until this measurement is slightly smaller than the first. And I'll explain why this needs to be the case later in the video. Installation of this slave cylinder is rather interesting since it has to be bled and hydraulically connected to the master before the transmission can go back in. In the event that the hydraulics have to be bled in the future, the transmission will have to be removed to access the bleeder screw. They do sell remote bleeding kits for these, but I didn't really feel like having another line to secure under the truck, especially with the hot exhaust running directly next to the bell housing. But that is an option if your setup allows for it. Once the hydraulics are put together, the transmission can be reinstalled on the bell housing, taking care to install the slave cylinder on the input shaft on its way in. To keep the hydraulics from getting wrapped around the input shaft of the transmission, we will install this stud that rests against the hydraulic line going into the slave cylinder. The kit actually comes with one that's supposed to replace one of the studs on the input shaft seal, but it didn't fit my particular T5, so maybe that's for the Mustang T5. So I just hastily crafted one out of some bolts and attached it to where the clutch fork previously would pivot off of. Once the transmission and drive shaft are secured in the vehicle, we can move on to the exhaust itself. To keep the exhaust short, sweet, and simple, I'm just using off-the-shelf 2 1/4 exhaust segments from the local Advance Auto. I found some glasspack mufflers for a reasonable price on Amazon from the company Cherry Bomb, who I believe made the original glasspacks back in the 60s. I personally like glasspacks because they're relatively quiet at idle and normal driving, but allow for much louder operation at higher RPMs and loads, allowing you to be as respectful or obnoxious to your neighbors as you please. They're also relatively inexpensive. I think these were about 40 bucks each, but I've purchased them for as cheap as $20 from stores like Summit Racing. And I do have a bit of a confession. I'm actually not a fan of loud cars at all. I do think there's a lot of obnoxiously loud cars on the roadway, and it really is a nuisance to communities. But in something like this that has very little protections, similar to a motorcycle, I want to be able to be heard in people's blind spots so they're aware of my presence on the occasion that I drive this truck on a busy highway. Just about everything else I own has a factory exhaust, or something slightly louder than factory, but not a nuisance to the pedestrians and cyclists in our area. Since Mike and I had fashioned together a straight pipe for the oxygen sensor during the Sniper install, we'll start with the passenger side on this truck, which should be a little bit easier since it doesn't route near the slave cylinder bracket on the T5. With the pipe attached to the exhaust collector on the header, we can eyeball a line where the exhaust stays roughly around where the frame sits. And then using this beautiful pipe cutter that someone dropped off at the dump, we can cut the pipe to length. This was actually a pretty good trash find and perfect timing for this project. There was actually 2 of them, and the guy running the dump took the other and gave me this one. We can repeat this for each section of the exhaust to be attached to this exhaust bank and hold it in place with picture hanger wire for the time being. Once the exhaust is routed to the desired location, we can tack weld all the pieces together as they hang, and then remove it to thoroughly weld each section together. You could opt to weld it while it's still attached to the vehicle, but with how long it's taken me to get to this point, I'd rather play it safe and remove it and weld it on the ground. I repeated this entire procedure for the driver's side exhaust bank. However, I opted to use the controversial flex pipe around the transmission to make routing quick and easy, since the pipe has to make a series of consecutive bends to get around the transmission. And the bend radius of pipes available on the shelf at Advance Auto were not tight enough to clear this area. Once the exhaust is complete, we can take it for a test drive, and here's where I ran into my first issue. Remember what I said about those distances while setting the shims? Well, it turns out if you shim that gap exactly, when the transmission goes in, it can put a little bit of pressure on that pressure plate, which will cause the clutch to slip. So unfortunately for me, I had to drop the transmission yet again to remove one or two of the shims and reassess the situation. And luckily removing a shim or two seemed to do the trick. So just keep that in mind if you get one of these kits and install it yourself. And with all that done, we can take it out for another test drive to really feel out how this exhaust is going to sound. And while I can get on the throttle a lot more, I'm still really nervous to give it the beans. And just like the straight pipe exhaust, I'm having a difficult time getting a good sounding clip to put in this video. And with that, I think we're at a good stopping point for this episode, as we still need to fabricate proper exhaust hangers, among other long overdue items. So if you like obscure and relatively unreliable American vehicles, be sure to subscribe, because I'm always adding vehicles to my fleet, like this 1987 LeBaron that talks. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.